Hunter Coates is an undergraduate student and aspiring academic. Currently, he is pursuing a philosophy and history double BA at Georgia College and State University. After graduation, he plans to work towards a PhD in philosophy. In February 2023, Hunter published his first full-length text titled Conspiracy and the Subject, a Lacanian Enterprise. And in fact, this is Hunter's second time on the pod, and this episode, there you go. This one is going to be fully on the book, Conspiracy and Subject. And I was, just before we started recording, kind of joking around with Hunter that just yesterday, I think they had the Congress hearings for UFOs, which certainly is tightly related. It certainly is. It pertains to the topic of conspiracy. But we didn't plan this. We didn't even know there was going to be any Congress hearing. It just worked out that way. All right, Hunter, thanks for being on the pod, mate. I really appreciate it. So the first question is a very, very general one. What made you want to write a book on conspiracies from a Lacanian perspective? And also maybe a bit of a follow-up question. I recall in one of our conversations, you said that even Alenka Zupančič had a bit of influence on your whole line of thinking. But yeah, for starters, what made you want to write a book on conspiracies?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in conspiracies. Can you hear me well?
Yep, perfect. Audio's
perfect. All right. Yeah, so I've always been interested in conspiracies for a very long time. I mean, probably when I was like 14, 15, I started watching videos online of conspiracies. And, at that time, I was more interested in actually joining conspiracies. After a while, I was like, well, these don't really seem to be panning out. You go through the 9/11 ones and you go through the various, stuff like that. And it's like, something's not fitting here. The pieces aren't matching perfectly. And so I just around maybe 2 years ago, I started to look more into criticizing them. And I eventually got into philosophy, just not from this, just in various other interests. Got into philosophy, psychoanalysis, and I was looking at one of my favorite authors, Alenka Zupančič. She's a contemporary of Slavoj Žižek. They are both from Ljubljana. I struggle with the city name, Ljubljana, Slovenia. It's like a small academic school that has Hegel and Lacan, academics come out of it. And I was listening to an interview with her, and she was discussing, a paper or something she was writing about conspiracies. And so I got about 10 minutes in, and I turned it off and I started to write. I immediately turned the interview off, started to write, never looked back, never finished the interview. I don't know what she talked about, but so that was the interview probably came out in August, and I started to really, really start writing in early September, I'd say. At first, it was going to be a paper. That's it. It's going to be about 15, 20 pages. It was my first long-term writing assignment. I've always written small papers here and there. There's a paper on my academia portal. It's Deleuze and Guattari and the War Machine, which is 6 pages. I have a paper on Lacan's notion of the act. It's about 6 pages. So this was a pretty big paper. I was thinking, 15, 20 pages. And I got to that limit. And I was like, well, what do I do now? I've never written this much. And so instead of just cutting it off and saying, all right, I'm done, leave all these ideas in the ether, now I decided to go forward, and that became a book. So that's kind of how we got here. And
on the note, I'll leave a link down below to your academia page.
Yeah, sure.
I only realized, as I was telling you yesterday, that you in fact publish a lot over there and share your writing there, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
So for starters, what do you think? Well, in many ways, this question is a bit unfair because this book is all about that. But what do you think psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis, has to say our current social reality pertaining to conspiracies? Yeah.
So I think psychoanalysis has a lot to say about social reality in general today, because it's a very timeless study. One of the main critiques from people like Deleuze, Guattari, Jacques Derrida was that psychoanalysis was what's known as trans-historical, which means that it doesn't pertain to what it studies and its knowledge apparatus to a single time period. It says that no, what it has found as the truth is is not just relative to that time period. It extends to, I would say, the entirety of human history, and that's why we have various people like Lacan talking about the story of Antigone from Sophocles, and Hamlet, Shakespeare. Lacan talking about Hamlet from Shakespeare. So I would say that psychoanalysis is transhistorical. For many people, that's a huge no-no. You can't do that, right? You're very relative. And so I think that's the first thing. Psychoanalysis is transhistorical, and it's openly transhistorical. We believe that the unconscious has been here since the beginning. Now, I have different views regarding why now. We can get into that later, but the unconscious has been here since the beginning. And I would say that when people tend to hear a statement like that, since the beginning, since human history, it's very grand. It's a very grandiose theory, and grandiose theories are out of style in academia today. And style in academia today is theories that pertain to what is going on now and what does this just matter for now. But psychoanalysis is all about grandiose theories, trying to explain large social phenomenon. That's why I think it's perfect for conspiracy, because conspiracies are also transhistorical. Conspiracies have existed since the beginning of time, various ways that they've shaped and manifested, but they've what I outline as the I guess the structure of conspiracy, which I can go into, is the same for now and all time, at least from all the conspiracies I've looked at, and I've looked at a ton. So
yeah, that's well put, because obviously the content is going to change, but then the form itself, it seems rather, as you said, transhistorical. Although, to read it in a Hegelian way, one could argue that the form affects the content too, right? So, anyway,
yes,
I don't want
that too.
So, okay, on the question on universalism and whatnot, how can I ask this? Maybe I'll ask it in a bipartite manner. You were talking about how the unconscious, it's transhistorical, or ever since Homo sapiens, let's say, became subjects, for lack of a better way of putting it. How do you think, at least from your point of view, psychoanalysis tackles subjectivity? And then what do you think, because you've brought up obviously German idealists in this book, German idealism has to say about the subject?
Yeah. So in psychoanalysis, you can kind of look at subjectivity in different ways depending on who you're looking at. With Freud, subjectivity, well, depending on what your interpretation is, subjectivity was either split, or it was the splitness that begins, like when a person is born and they're going through life, they eventually get to a sense of wholeness. This is a way to read Freud. I don't think this is the correct way. The common German word, well, the common German phrase to get this reading is I'll say it in English, whatever. Okay. Where I was, there, where it was, there I shall be. Which is saying that where it was, where the id was, where the unconscious, the primal influence of humanity in a Hobbesian way, where it was, there I shall be. A wholeness will be created as I develop through my life, and I'll be able to push these Hobbesian feelings down, and I can eventually get this wholeness in my life where everything's great and happy. So that's a way to read Freud, and that was very popular in the American schools, the Neo-Freudian schools, and also various British Freudians like Melanie Klein, who I respect in other ways, but I think she's wrong here. Melanie Klein, and then his daughter, Anna Freud.
Yeah, I think
I mentioned Melanie Klein a little bit in here. But yeah, so that's one way to read Freud's theory of subjectivity. Then there's another way, and then Lacan is the other way. What Lacan does is he says, when Freud says, there it was, there I shall be, Freud is saying that it remains in the I, which is to say that there is a split in the I. When people say I, they are always instituting a sort of splitness, what they're talking about. Now, a simple example, let's say I'm talking about going to the store. I want to go to the store. So there's two aspects of this statement. There's the I, like the conscious I that wants to go to the store. There's also the unconscious I, or what Lacan calls the subject of enunciation, where it's the underlying reason why I want to go to the store. Maybe I want to go to the store because it could just be something simple as like, I haven't eaten in a while, I'm hungry, right? Or it could be something more like, I want to see someone I like there, you know? So you can take that as much as you want, but the point is that there's always this underlying reason under the conscious intent to go to the store. Now, what this gets us to is with subjectivity and German idealism, you can kind of find a similar trajectory here. You have Kant. Well, the beginning of German idealism is this guy named Gottfried Leibniz, but he's kind of, we don't need to talk about him right now. So we'll say Kant. Immanuel Kant was a very important philosopher because what he did was he showed past philosophy before him that you cannot just suppose that we have direct interaction with the world. Philosophy up to Kant more or less was like, yes, of course, like when we interact with the world, objects in the world exist the way that we see them. Kant was like, well, how do we know that, right? We only know that because we think we know that. We've never been in a world where we know that objects did not appear that way. And the reason why is because we're in this world, right? So in our current world, we've never been in a world where we can know that objects do truly exist the way that they appear to us. Now, I don't want to go into Kant's terms, it's too confusing, but that's the main gist of Kant's philosophy. And this extends to ethics as well. We don't really know what the highest good is, but we can think about what like relative goods are. We can think about what good actions are. We can do those actions, and then beyond all these actions, there's some sort of amorphous highest good. So that's kind of the same thing, follows as ethics, follows as metaphysics. Now, from Kant, we touch into this guy named G.W.F. Hegel. Hegel was a philosopher after Kant. And Hegel says, well, Kant's wrong. You know, Kant says we cannot know the world how it is. I think we can. And the reason why we can is because to say that we can't, you have to have, you're creating some sort of limit. And if you create a limit, you have already stepped beyond a limit. Now, many scholars have criticized Hegel's line of thinking here, but the basic idea is if I am standing in the street and you're standing in the street, I draw a line. I've now created two sides of the street. I haven't just created one side and there's nothing over here. I've created two sides of the street. So Hegel would say that, well, if you say there's a cutoff line that we cannot know X, to say that you have already known that you cannot know X. Therefore, you can't say you can't know X. You can't create limits on what we can know, is Hegel's point. Now, later I can discuss why I disagree with that, but that's Hegel's point. So Hegel wants to say that. Now, this gets into subjectivity because he would say, well, rather than us not knowing where the center of our selfhood is, what's the true point would be that our self is two things at once. It's a subject and an object. When we think something, we are both the object and the subject because we're thinking something, being a subject, an activity, but there's also something being thought, and that being thought is still in the subject. But if it's being thought in the subject, that subject has to be an object as well. Now, Hegel has, at this point, completely deconstructed major points of philosophy. So the duality of subject and object was very important to philosophy up to this point that Kant even bought into. But Hegel says, no, the subject, the person, the I, is always a subject and an object. Now, tying this back to Lacan would say that what the subject and the object is both, it is the split subject, because the split subject is always thinking itself and it's always being thought as well. And that's the thinking in the unconscious.
Understood. That's well put. Very, very succinct and clear. Although we'll touch on this later, your disagreement with Hegel's delineation of the limitation itself being kind of ontological, let's say, I would like to discuss that. Maybe that's a good point to bring up when we talk about Christianity.
Yes.
Okay, so here, Hunter, is perhaps, and I even mentioned this to you before, speaking about the split subject. And okay, maybe I'll ask this question in perhaps a tripartite, or let's say bipartite manner. So we have the split subject, and we have obviously we have as Lacanian psychoanalysis in particular highlights the lack in the subject, this kind of almost like a void, and that causes our desire, objet, all of that.
Well, kind of. There's a distinction we should make here. And I made this, I think, at the end of the book, but I really didn't go into it. I should have, but the difference is loss versus lack. So a lack still has a being, because when you lack something, you're lacking a something. A loss for Lacan is like a just complete void. Now, one of the ways to understand this would be like the person who is psychotic, that's deemed psychotic in Lacanian psychoanalysis. Talk about psychosis a lot, but just to say this as a starting point, the person who's deemed psychotic has a loss of the symbolic order. They cannot identify and engage in language and enjoy things in the way that most people can. They don't have a lack of the symbolic order, they have a loss. Lacan uses the notion of a whole, like, well, he plays on words, H-O-L-E, whole, like a hole in the symbolic order, and whole, W-H-O-L-E, because the symbolic order is wholly in the whole, in that sense, where it's completely put in this void. There is no symbolic order for the psychotic subject.
And it's
So that's
not
the difference
it's not like a
between,
positively charged substantial void. It's just a actual void, literally a
a
void.
void. Yes. Yeah.
And then how would you define lack?
So lack is, again, like lack of something. If I want water, I have a lack of water, and that's why I desire it.
And that's
I
how it
have,
connects to the object in that sense, right? Sorry to interrupt you.
yeah. So the object would basically just be what, when I desire something, there's always something behind that desire. So I desire water, right? But I don't just desire water as like a complete end. I desire something beyond that water. I might desire, I don't know, food afterwards, right? So there's always this thing beyond what I am desiring. And for Lacan, he would say that the ultimate thing beyond what I'm desiring is not like a particular thing like that exists in the world. It's actually just the negativized lack. So lack itself is what I am truly desiring in order, so I desire lack in order to keep desiring. It's very, very paradoxical. But the point would be that Lacan says we don't really want what we think we want. We want to have that gap between receiving something fully and not receiving it at all. We want to be somewhere in the middle. When we drink water, we don't want to be completely full with water, because then we can't eat, right? You drink too much water, you can't eat, and then that kind of sucks. So we want to be somewhere in the middle. We want water, but we don't want like enough water where we can't eat. So that's kind of how I would analogize it.
Yeah, and it's metonymic, right? It's like that the Oscar Wilde quote. I'm completely paraphrasing it, but it's like the worst day in your life is when you get what you want.
Yeah. Zizek talks a lot about this, where he has like various quips where he's like, people say they want happiness, right? But what is happiness? It's just this like ignoranceful bliss, right?
Yeah.
Now, he would say that we don't really want happiness. We want the attempt to get happiness. We enjoy the journey and able to get happiness. But once we get happiness, we immediately want to give it away and join back in the journey. So that's,
and it moves. We discussed quite a bit of this in the last episode.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, I think I do appreciate the fact that, Hunter, you're laying down some of the foundational theoretical concepts, because to get back to your book, we need to build that groundwork, so to speak.
That's the first chapter. For those that are listening, the first chapter is an entire introduction to Lacan. I basically treat it as if you've never heard of Lacan before. I treat everything, I break down all his terms, and
it is really an unbelievable accomplishment, given that it's kind of like an introduction to, well, mostly Lacan, but even a bit of Hegel and German idealism, and you connect your concepts to that. Okay, now that you've kind of sort of laid the groundwork, let's discuss. And here's okay. So from the whole book, this perhaps for me was your most important idea. What we call it theoretical insight. So please, Hunter, take as much time as you want to flesh this out. It's the idea of the non-lacking big other.
Yes.
And I think that was such a brilliant insight. I never thought of how that relates to conspiracy theories.
Yes.
And if you don't mind me making this request, perhaps even try to kind of bring it to a bit of a pedestrian level, because I think it is extremely just at a very ethical level valuable to understand this concept, given what's going on, well, as we said in the beginning, with what's happening in the States, with the Congress hearings, UFOs, QAnon, all of that. So, okay, I'll just ask it plainly. As per your understanding, apropos conspiracies and psychoanalysis, or Lacanian psychoanalysis, why is the big other thought of as non-lacking?
So first, what is the big other is the big question. So the big other is just this sort of term that we use to group a lot of different authorities in society, right? You can have physical authorities, like for conspiracies, you would have like news companies and the government, right? But also like non-physical authorities, like moral laws and cultural norms. So the big other is just this term that we use to say, like, well, someone says like, oh, you're desiring the big other, you're desiring the authority of a moral law or a cultural norm. It's just a term we use to say authority in society, put simply. Now, the non-lacking big other is from Lacan. Now, I discussed a little bit about psychosis, and this is where psychosis comes back in. Lacan says that in psychosis, the subject cannot accept that the big other is lacking. In the simple sense, this just means that, like, for instance, let's say you go in for a handshake and the person goes in for a fist bump, right? There's a lack here. Someone did not get the memo from the big other, from the colloquial norms in society. Someone didn't get the memo here. So what Lacan would say is that people that are normal or neurotic subjects, they understand that there are gaps. Like, for instance, if someone goes in for a fist bump, you go in for a handshake, there's not a huge freak out. Everyone's just like, oh, haha, you kind of laugh it off. Kind of laugh it off, right? Most people do. If you were to freak out, like, what? You thought I was going for a handshake? What? That doesn't really track. People think you're kind of, a little loco. So so what the non-lacking big other is it's the position for the person who cannot recognize that these rules in society fail, that there's lack. So the person that is non-lacking, the person that's psychotic in Lacanian terms, would be the person that gets like upset, right? If you go in for a fist bump, they go in for a handshake, there's like a freak out moment, right? They've encountered this traumatic thing, they can't understand it, right? Another thing would be Freud defines the psychotic as a flight from reality. So instead of dealing with the reality of, oh, okay, cool, we're gonna choose either a handshake or a fist bump, you can't do both at the same time, the psychotic tries to fly away from it. They might literally try and run away depending on, the situation. The point is that they cannot, in like a psychic sense, they cannot understand that the big other is lacking. That is the position of psychosis in Lacan's overture. Now, this ties into conspiracies because I have a term that I create called deception with a capital D, like capital D and then ECEPTION. So deception with a capital D is the position of the person that cannot recognize that the big other is lacking. And due to this, they create a big other who is non-lacking. More specifically, in terms of conspiracies, what they do is they create deception, the belief that the big other is deceiving them, that authorities in society are deceiving them. They create this as their big other. This becomes their own authority. Deception becomes the authority of this person.
So perhaps just to bring it to the pedestrian level, maybe give a few examples.
Sorry.
Of, maybe for like the non-lacking big other, what are a few examples you'd say?
Yeah. So a person that believes in a non-lacking big other, I already did the colloquial gesture thing, but what this might also be is like, a great example is 9/11. So I give this example in my book, I think chapter 2 or maybe end of chapter 1. Basically where the person that believes in a non-lacking big other cannot understand that the government just did not have the response time to stop the terrorist. They cannot come to that conclusion. They believe that the government must be deceiving them. The government did have the response time, but they chose not to for whatever reason, right? So this is that precise play of deception. They can't come to terms with the government is like not perfect. There's various issues and probably communication channels. We even have evidence that there were issues in communication channels. That's not in the book. That's more like empirical stuff, but we do have evidence that there were issues, but the subject, the conspiratorial subject, cannot accept that there were issues in communication channels. They can't accept that the government did not have perfect response time. So because they can't accept this lack in the big other, the government, they create deception. They say that, no, the government must be deceiving me. They do have the ability, but they chose not to. And that's where the conspiracy comes in. Why did they choose not to? Then we get into, all the various theories. Well, maybe the government hired them. Maybe George Bush did it himself. Maybe Israel did it, So that's where the conspiracies just get pushed in. It's like I don't think I gave this analogy, but I'm thinking about this now. It's like a spider web. The web is all the conspiracies, and they're all like stuck on the web. But the web is only created when you give way to deception. When you let deception win, when you say, well, the government must have been able to, that's when the web is created. And the web has all those different conspiracies that you can pick and choose from. Of course, you can't hold that both George Bush and Israel did 9/11, right? You pick and choose. But the point is that they're both on that web of conspiracy theories.
So Hunter, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming what you postulate is in fact in the real, let's say, the big other is lacking.
Yeah.
And how does that differ? How does that statement differ from the Zizekian Lacanian kind of proclamation that there is no big other? Is it the same thing?
Yeah. So yeah, it's the same. The point, Lacan's point would be that there is no big other, but we believe in a big other. We create these social gestures, we create these norms and laws in order to give us a sense of closure, in order to give us a sense of belonging, right? But the truth for Lacan, and the atheist truth, would be that there is no big other. There is no ultimate authority. So that's what Lacan and Zizek would say. We create these laws, we create these to give us a sense of belonging, but beyond this like illusion of belonging, there's nothing. There is nothing up here. There is no, transcendent goodness or God, whatever.
This is the Zizekian reading of the fiction, right?
Yeah, that's Zizek's reading.
Zizek's reading. Although recently I've been reading a lot of more like theological literature, especially from Orthodox Christianity, that kind of challenges that. But we'll get to that.
Based. Yeah, we can get to that later.
Yeah.
All right.
The fantastic channel Telos Bound.
Yes. I'm good friends. Yeah, with Trey.
I've just got his book. What's his name? Trent, is it?
Trey Lunnett. Yeah.
I've just got his book, The Impossibility of Subjectivity, and I'm hoping to read it and then have him on the pod because my God, what a perspicacious thinker.
Trey's really great. I have not finished that book. He gave me a couple of chapters. I read the first couple of chapters, but it's basically each chapter focuses on a different thinker. You get Zizek, and then you get like Sartre, and then you get someone else. And the last chapter is his journey from atheist philosophy to Christianity. Yeah, so it's really interesting, and he'll tell you the story of everything. I don't want to go into it, but he has a whole story of how it came and all that. So
yeah. Anyway, hopefully we could have him on soon. Yeah. Okay, Hunter. So the other big theoretical insight for me was this something you introduced called unconspiracy. Yeah, which I love that term. So firstly, I'll read out an excerpt, which obviously this doesn't do it justice, but it's a good kind of little let's call it an introductory excerpt to what this concept of unconspiracy is. So on page 113, you state, instead of the dichotomy of accepting conspiracy or the mainstream narrative, I introduce the analysis of unconspiracy, a third term beyond the present dichotomy. To classify this, we recognize the big other. Sorry, let me read that again. To classify this, we recognize the other is lacking, and deception is recognized through such castration. Hence, we do not affirm that truth is found in what the other says, or that truth is found in what the other does not say. Truth is found in what the other can never say. So you go into dialectics and all that afterwards, but so what's the idea of unconspiracy?
Yeah, so this was an idea that I had like very late writing the book. I was kind of just playing around with the word conspiracy. I was trying to create like double entendres, and I thought of the word and I was like, an unconspiracy, and I was like, it's very Hegelian, inversing the notion of conspiracy. So in short, and I mentioned somewhere that Lacan even has a kind of a term for this. He calls it the organum. I believe in Seminar 12, he says it once, and he says that the organum is the realization of lack. It's a Latin word. But that's kind of what a conspiracy is. It's the realization of the big other's lack and learning to deal with it, is kind of what the point is. So when it comes to conspiracy, it's not choosing the mainstream narrative and being, I wholly believe in this 9/11, that yes, exactly happened this way. It's not that I don't wholly believe in it. It's just that like neither side is completely right. There's something in the middle, but not in like the centrist sense, but more in the sense of like both sides are trying to create a narrative and both the narratives are just battling each other. So why battle in the narrative? Realize the lack in both narratives, and that's the truth.
Okay, how does okay? I see what you're saying, but how does that differ from the, let's say, the caricature dialectics of Hegel? You know, the kind of the thesis and antithesis, synthesis kind of thing.
So
How does that?
it's a double negation. It's a negation of the mainstream narrative, negation of the conspiratorial narrative, and this then sublates or goes beyond itself into a new narrative. And this new narrative isn't really a narrative per se. It's just kind of the sense that we're realizing the lacks of both these narratives in order to try and create a better, better project, a better, you can fill in with better whatever political project, better. Yeah, I mean, like a political example would be like realizing the lack of the left and right, and then those recognizing where each party has those breaks where they don't fully get stuff accurate, and then trying to create something from that. So that's kind of what it is. I took this idea a little bit off of Deleuze and Guattari's notion of creating new concepts. They don't have a Hegelian or dialectical understanding, and so I was thinking like creating new concepts. Okay, apply Hegel to it. The lack, find the lack. What does the lack become? Whatever the lack becomes is what unconspiracy would be. So
Interesting.
it's a bit of a concept that I'm probably not going to explore much. I kind of found it and I was dealing with it a little bit. I think I liked the way I used it in the last chapter when it came to QAnon, but and I don't find it to be as productive as some of the other stuff that I talked about. So
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to go too deeply into it. Although I would say this, and correct me if I'm wrong, because the kind of the naive centrist way would be to completely ignore the lack in the big other and just be like, oh, both sides have an element of truth. Whereas I feel like
that's the point, is to say that there's lack on both sides. It's the opposite. It's not that both sides have the truth. It's that both sides have the lack, and that beneath the lack, beneath both lacks is the truth. Yeah.
So we kind of acknowledge the negative in that sense. Okay, so because I really do want to get to the topic on Christianity and theology, but before you get too fatigued or tired, although
I'm good. I mean, I can go for another hour 30.
Oh, fantastic, man. Yeah, be fantastic. Because it's kind of important given that in current milieu, we need to do with like a cultural analysis or critique.
Sure.
How would you say? Okay, I'm gonna throw out a few terms here, so forgive me if it's a bit too much. But you wrote the book, so I feel like you'll be able to manage. So you've said when it comes to conspiracy and capitalism, like what it's like. Why is there a rise in conspiracy theories under capitalistic society? You've discussed ideas such as the Baudrillardian system of objects, and how people who are conspiracy theorists, or let's say conspiratorial subjects, they kind of treat collecting conspiracies like the Baudrillardian system of objects, and that's something that pertains to capitalism, of course. Or we also have this idea of the loss of the social. So yeah, I mean, it's not really a question. It's more like, when I'm throwing out all these terms, how would you say in our current social reality of neoliberal capitalism, we have conspiracies?
Yeah. So for this one, I would say that conspiracies tend to fester because they function off accumulation as well. When someone has a conspiracy, they tend to get more conspiracies. You adopt one conspiracy and then you go, what's more? What more are they hiding? And that's exactly deception too. What more are they hiding? They're deceiving me. So it's like kind of how accumulation functions in capitalism, where the simple Hegelian stance, Marxian stance would be like, you have a working subject, and that working subject works in order to purchase something. When they purchase something, that something is never what they really want. Therefore, they have to keep working, and they have to keep purchasing and purchasing and purchasing. And what is beyond other purchasing? Well, that would be the object that elusive, perfect realization of their lack, which doesn't really happen. That's the point. So we would say that accumulation functions the same way for conspiracies. For conspiratorial subjects, there can never be a full realization of the conspiratorial truth. If for instance, if someone was to say, hey, if someone was like, all right, listen to me for a second. I have all the conspiratorial truths. Everything I'm going to tell you is true, and it's been something you've been lied to. I feel like most conspiratorial subjects would turn away. They enjoy not knowing if it's true. They enjoy the ambiguity of the truth of the conspiracy, which is why what you see a lot of times is people that are very conspiratorial, they have a lot of different conspiracies they draw from. And all these conspiracies equal one worldview. But if you were just to say what that one worldview is that all the conspiracies are leading to, they would reel back. What do you mean? No, I'm just have these different conspiracies, right? But all of the conspiracies really point to that one worldview. And to say that one worldview causes them to reel back. Kind of like for accumulation, you continue to accumulate commodities, stuff, whatever you want to say, continue to accumulate, and all these are pointing towards one thing. But if you ask someone, hey, I have what you really want, they'd go, no, I don't really want that. What? No, don't give that to me. So that's the whole point, is that conspiracies function the same way with the objet d'art, which would be the end of conspiracy, the full conspiratorial sketch outlined.
So in the end of the book, you use QAnon and Trump.
Yes.
You juxtapose those two, let's say.
Yeah.
So how does that relate to the lack and the idea of accumulation and whatnot?
Yeah, real quick, I just want to talk about the loss of the social as well.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yep.
And there's another term you use, Baudrillard. I'll go into that a little bit. Okay, so yeah. So loss of the social is basically my idea that when someone is fully bought into conspiracy and they fully believe in deception, they start thinking everyone around them is out to get them. They start questioning their relationships. Oh, is this person deceiving me? Is this? And this is loss of the social. They have to engage in this like inwardness where they fully just have to, seclude themselves and all that. And I would say that I give an example in terms of capitalism, where loss of the social would be the existence of gated communities where people create these gates, and these gates function precisely just to keep people out. They don't really create safety, right? Because the people in the community still have alarm systems and state-of-the-art cameras, right? They're simply made to keep people even out of the vicinity of the people in the communities. And so I kind of equate and talk about how the relationship between those two works. And I think chapter 3, I believe so. And when it comes to system of objects, so Baudrillard's gives an example in the system of objects. All right, this is going to be a haymaker. I believe it's page 53. I don't know why I remember that, but I believe it's page 53.
Crazy that you remember that.
There's no way that's right. I don't know that. Numbers in my head. But basically what Baudrillard does is he gives an example of baseball cards, right? Someone wants to collect baseball cards, but they don't really want to collect all of them, right? Because then there's nothing more to collect. You have to move on to something else. So the collector always wants that lack. That lack in the collection creates the fuel for collecting more. If that lack is realized, they don't want to collect anymore. That's kind of the tie-in I would do. And then I think I tied this into how, again, with accumulation and stuff, when things are accumulated, there's that ultimate thing. That thing, if were to be realized, the person would go, no, I actually don't want that. Put that back. I don't want that. I want to keep accumulating. That lack, that objet d'art, gives them the fuel for accumulation. Okay, I think that's good.
So in that line of thought, it would be interesting to kind of, let's say, speculate. It would be that the worst thing for a conspiratorial subject would be if, in fact, in reality, there is a non-lacking big other who's got all the answers and who tells them, this is it, you found the truth, the ultimate truth, and that would completely rob them of their Jewish zones, and that'd be the end of their, and they would hate that, wouldn't it? Because what they with itself.
Some of the Jewish zones, some of the enjoyment, painful enjoyment, is from the conspiracy not being accepted. When conspiracies are accepted, you would think they're like, oh yes, everyone else gets to know now. Everyone found the truth. No, they want to be the bearers of the truth. Now, this is kind of tie this into a little bit in theology. There's kind of a Gnostic element here, where there's like this, where they want to be the only ones that can mystically read the Bible. Everyone else got it wrong. But the conspiratorial subjects believe that they are the special people that only can understand it. So this would be a Gnostic element, where the Gnostics were like, no, special people, me and my friends, we can read the Bible. We know what it says. We get these secret truths out that are in Plato, and they're in the Bible too. We get these truths out, but everyone else, they're wrong. So this would kind of be a conspiratorial subject. You would think, kind of like the Gnostics, you would think they want everyone, when this truth in the Bible is to be found, everyone gets to know it, but no, precisely opposite. They want to be that secret club. They want to be the ones that are repelling from the big other, from, I guess, the church institutions, the Gnostic case. So yeah.
Yeah, Peter Rollins, a theologian, he has a joke that in some of these self-help seminars, they'll be like, okay, step 1 to 4, it's free, but 4 to 7, you got to pay for it. It's behind the scenes, but then 4 to 7, in fact, it's also nothing. It's bland. So the idea is it's the unknown itself is what drives us. So
yes,
Hunter, when I was reading that part of the book, particularly the Baudrillardian system of objects part, I couldn't but remember. I did the book. Where is it? Yeah. Todd McGovern's Capitalism and Desire.
I've not read that, but I read a really lengthy review about 2 years ago of the book.
Was it by Michael Downs? He's got a really good.
No, it was by my friend, and it was
Okay.
very weird. I was reading this at like a St. Patrick's Day parade.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it was very weird. Now I remember I was like sitting there and I was hanging with my friends and I was just reading, and yeah, so
I love that.
story.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, because this many parts of the book, actually, not just the Baudrillardian part, but especially the part about the idea of accumulation and whatnot, it did really make me think of the first chapter, which is the subject of desire and the subject of capitalism. And I thought a lot of the at least the forms or the concepts, well, it makes sense because he based the book on Lacan. It relates to the idea of the accumulation and desire, and the fact that this kind of lack is metonomic. We need to keep accumulating. It's quite important.
Yeah, I actually don't own a single book by Todd McGowan. I read his book 2005 by Sunny, End of Enjoyment. I read that book. I checked it out from the library. I quote it actually in somewhere I quote it. I think chapter 2. But that's the only book that I've really read by Todd McGowan, and I know he has so much work that I need to read. But yeah, I just need to. Yeah, so,
he's brilliant. He's a great expositor of Hegel and Lacan, especially.
When it comes to Hegel, I quite disagree with him.
Interesting, because I was going to talk to. I'm trying to get him on the pod, in fact, and I want to talk about his book, Emancipation After Hegel. And he has this beautiful chapter. I even wrote about it recently on love and contradiction, which I thought was just the way he writes itself is so beautiful, and I cherished that chapter. Although I don't know what my thoughts are, like theoretical thoughts on that chapter yet, but the general point is I find that him to be at least a good introductory expositor of Hegel and German Idealism.
Yes. For someone who wants to get into like the Hegel Lacan space, they should read McGowan first rather than Zizek.
Yeah, because Zizek is certainly a lot more entertaining, but
yes,
he is not the best writer, I think.
No, definitely not. Yeah.
He's got a bit of a. In fact, he has a title called. He's called "The Confessions of a Radioactive Mind," and I think that defines it well. His mind.
That defines him. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of this book was written in a very Zizekian style.
You mean your book?
Yeah, my book. Yeah.
Oh, man, I thought you were a very clear writer.
Really? Okay, that's good.
The reason I read it twice was because I felt like I wanted to do a bit of due diligence, given that we were going to have a conversation.
Yeah.
But the first time I read it, a lot of it stood. I got it all, and you introduced the concepts really well, especially as we know Lacan's notoriously dense.
Yes.
So I thought you were really.
That's good. But definitely my writing style has changed a bit from this. I don't know. It's more chronological, you can say, kind of. I don't know. It may just be like evolving as a writer, but yeah, that's all I want to say.
Okay, so the next question is on the speaking of Zizek, the hermeneutic temptation, and you've got. I couldn't note down which. I've got a bookmark probably. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. And so you've spoken about that and how that pertains to conspiracies, a Zizekian idea, certainly. I don't know if it's an original idea by Zizek, but certainly something that
it is. Yes.
And I think it's a good one, particularly to the topic at hand. What is the hermeneutic temptation? And then as like a follow-up to that, how do we, let's say if it's even possible, resist it?
Yeah. So the hermeneutic of temptation is basically what Zizek says is the attempt to read meaning into things that do not have meaning. Would basically be the refusal of, Freud has that classic quote, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So the hermeneutic of temptation would be the refusal of that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. They would say, no, actually that cigar always has meaning. There's always something further to be given. And the kind of weird, ironic thing is that a lot of people read psychoanalysis as the hermeneutic of temptation. They go, psychoanalysis always says that there's something more, but sometimes there's not, you know? Now, we would say that sometimes there is, most of the time there is, but there are some things that are just a cigar. It's, you can get into how to define and distinguish between those two, which I don't know if anyone's written about, actually, the difference between how to know that there's something to psychoanalyze versus it's just a cigar. Interesting topic, but we do recognize that some things are just a cigar. And the hermeneutic of temptation when it comes to conspiracy would be people to say that, well, this, again, back to 9/11, we'll say the government failed their response. They would read into it and go, there must be a deeper meaning here. It can't just be that the big other failed. It can't just be the big other lacking. There has to be a further meaning. And that further meaning would be, you know, whatever conspiracy they want to think of. So that's kind of how it ties into conspiracy. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think an example Zizek brings up all the time is the Holocaust, and
Uh-huh.
this is rather, in fact, a dark example he brings up, where it was such a traumatic event that some Jews, in fact, thought that they deserved it. That
Yeah, yeah. So the Orthodox rabbinical, there's a sect of Orthodox rabbinical Jews who believed it was God's punishment. Yeah,
God's punishment. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Because they would say that it was God's punishment for disobeying the Torah, because they saw like a big secular, like a big secularization of Judaism, during the Weimar Republic, which there was a large secularization of all people because it was a
Yeah.
very licentious time with the, you know, you've heard all the various stories about Berlin being the sex capital of the world. So they thought it was a just punishment from God. So yeah.
So that probably would be an example of the hermeneutic temptation, right?
Yeah, yeah. Zizek would say that.
Post meeting into something.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question on the book, Hunter, before we get to probably the rest of the conversation is going to be on your of you coming to Christ. Can I call it your testimony? I don't know.
Maybe, sure.
Yeah, so I don't know. Look, I know I don't expect you to give advice or anything because this is not a self-help book, obviously. But just since, you know, at the end of the day, to make it a bit more pedestrian, just practical advice. How would you say, from your reading of all these thinkers, I would say in-depth reading of all these thinkers, how do you differentiate between a false conspiracy theory and something that isn't? Not that I'm asking for some kind of rule of thumb or framework, because that's, we all know that doesn't work. But just I would ask, maybe intuitively, how do you, you know, let's say, separate fact from fiction, for lack of a better term? Yeah.
So I think this is very difficult and something I probably should have spent more time on. At the beginning of chapter 1, I kind of wanted to make clear that I'm not deriding all conspiracy theories. I say, like, MK Ultra was true, Watergate was true, and I give these examples to say, like, clearly I'm not denying all conspiracy theories, right? That I make that very clear at the start, because people would be like, well, conspiracy theories haven't proven true, which is accurate, right? But I think there is some sort of rule of thumb, even though we can't really kind of explain it, that when the person believes that some deception is so strong and it disagrees so much with how the world functions, like if someone believes in an international cabal of lizards, you know, that's kind of so different from how the world functions that intuitively it strikes us as they're positing this level of deception, which is so, like, out of the ordinary that we kind of can just call it a conspiracy. Now, if someone was like, oh, I think that there was some sort of 9/11, you can say, like, what would, like, let me think of a good example. Someone would be like,
well, can I bring up something
yeah,
quite, say, simple, like, for instance, in the 60s,
yeah,
big tobacco, they
yeah,
conspired.
yeah.
They
That's a great
conspired
example.
to hide the truth about what smoking does to your health.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
and that's not like a
they said
huge
so crazy.
conspiracy. Yeah. because you can draw like a very clear line, right? Profit motive, stopping, people from not smoking, getting them to smoke more, profit motive. Therefore, they lobby to create laws that lie. It's
Yeah.
so perfect, right? But with like an international cabal of lizards,
Yeah.
how do we get there? How do we get there?
Yeah.
So I think there is sort of a rule of thumb that we can kind of think of. I mean, maybe there's something I'll think about more if I get back to this.
What's interesting is
topic.
I know you've said that you haven't explicitly stated how to suss conspiracies and whatnot, but for me, again, this is why I in my view, from reading this twice, I felt like that idea of you talking about the non-lacking big other, and then the concept of unconspiracy, that itself is, it's just knowing that itself probably gives us some kind of practical way to deal with conspiracy.
So I was gonna say that a little bit. I was gonna say that, like, let's say you're talking to a friend and this happens to me all the time. When I hear someone talking and all of a sudden I hear these like words, they're hiding, secretive, like this is secretive, this is hiding, and I immediately bell goes off in my head. They're creating deception, right? They're positing a non-lacking big other. They can't deal with the lack. So I think something like that, right? I mean, if they're your friend, you can point it out to them, be like, that's kind of like, you see what you're doing here, right? You're saying that there must be something deeper in this when it probably isn't that anything deeper. It's probably just a failure, right, of an authority. You can do something like that, right? And this just happens all the time. So maybe that's a practical thing you can take out of it.
Yeah. No, that all makes sense. Okay, Hunter. Now a very interesting topic. If you went through the document I shared with you, I have a whole section on theology, because in fact,
Sure,
this book you have many theological points too. But before we get to the, let's say, the specifics, what's your story of, in fact, here's the message you sent me. You said, I asked from you, apart from the book, what else you want to discuss? And you said, I would like to discuss my recent coming to Christ moment and my current work in synthesizing my faith with psychoanalysis and Hegel. So the flow's yours. How did this happen?
So I'm not going to get too personal, but I'll say that I had an experience.
I understand.
I had an experience in April that was unexplainable, and I've tried explaining it. And for about 2 months after that, I was just sort of oscillating between various traditions, kind of looking at various traditions. And I would say about 3 weeks ago, it just kind of hit me that I should start worshiping and praying. So I just started praying. And since then, it just became a practice. And it's kind of, I mean, there's much more, but I'm not trying to get too personal. But yeah, that's.
I understand. Yeah. So how does, well, the latter part of that message, you said you're trying to synthesize your faith with psychoanalysis and Hegel. And how does that?
Yeah. So in my recent essay on Christian universalism, I think the third sentence mentioned repression. So I'm drawing these ideas of repression and neuroticism and like all these different terms in psychoanalysis into my work now. The current essay I'm doing, I am literally giving like a topology of what I'm illustrating using Lacan, and I tie in Lacan's notions of big other, signification, desire, jouissance, object. All this is being put in my work that I'm currently doing. But the essay I just released, it kind of does that. There's like little hints here and there. In the footnotes, I'll put like Freud, blah, 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 Lacan, blah, 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 blah. So you're getting these hints and touches of psychoanalysis in the theological sphere I'm creating. When it comes to philosophy, I mean, theology and philosophy easily flow together. I talked about Hegel a little bit in that essay. I mentioned in the Christian Universalist essay, I mentioned his notion of spirit and the importance of recognizing personhood as communitarian, as personhood is not a individual, like a person. Like when we think of people, like a person, we tend to think of a single person. But what is truly a person? Well, a person is not just what their memories are, because a person's memories involve other people. So other people are always involved in what we call a person. This is why Hegel has the term spirit. Spirit for Hegel is never a single individual. Never. He never uses the term like that, because spirit always presupposes other people. We're always in community with other people. Now I would tie this into the Trinity and the communion that God is in with himself, with the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. But that's the point, is that we're always in community with other people. And this is why Hegel never uses the term spirit singular. So I use that a little bit, and I argue from there kind of some points about Christian universalism, which I can give a little introduction to that if I want to do that. But
Please do. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So Christian universalism is basically the belief in theology that eternal hell and eternal belief in hellfire does not exist. Now, there are many different paths you can go once you affirm this. You can affirm a sort of neutral universalism, where you believe that there is some sort of purgatory, and then eventually all people will be brought to heaven. You can believe in an immediate universalism, where there is no purgatory. When you die, no matter if you're Adolf Hitler or Pol Pot or the greatest person in the world, you will all go to heaven immediately. And there's also other variants. Maybe you go through some sort of trials of there's like a judgment day, there's a mini judgment day, and there's a later judgment day, and you get a lot of various intersects. I am somewhere in between neutral and immediate. I don't think immediate is, I can't see like someone like Hitler and someone like the biggest philanthropist ever immediately going to heaven right when they die, both immediately going to heaven. I think somewhere in the middle. I don't know if it's a purgatory, if you call it that, but I would say that there's some sort of separation that is induced for non-believers at the point of death. That separation is not eternal. That separation will always be overcome. When Christ returns, he will drag everyone out of this separation and bring them to God. And I think that's very important, is that people tend to think of eternality just because we're finite people, right? So when we think of eternality, we think, well, eternality is like, what, 10,000 years, 100,000 years? The world is not eternal in terms of the earth. When we think of how long the earth is, we think 4.2 billion years or whatever, right? That's not eternal. That seems eternal to us, but that's not truly eternal. I think it is outrageous and completely against the message of Christ to believe that there can be people that are fully separated from God for literally eternity. And we can't even comprehend what eternity is, because it is so beyond our comprehension. It is outside of time itself what eternity is. And to believe that just because someone has not come to Christ in this life, that they will be separated from God for eternity, is something that is completely against Christ's message, in my view. And there's various support from this. I mean, for instance, a lot of early church fathers read the Bible, and they had issues with the term eternity in the Bible. In ancient Greek, which is the New Testament is written in, there is not a term for eternity as we believe eternity now. When we define the word eternity now, we tend to speak of a duration outside of time itself. When the word eternity, or the Greek word for eternity, was used, it did not mean this. The Greeks did not have a concept of this. What they had a concept was a very, very long time, and this was eternity for them. But what this very, very long time was, we don't know. It could have been 10,000 years. It could have been 100,000 years. It could have been 1 billion years, but it was certainly not what we call eternity. That's why many church fathers that actually read Greek, unlike many people that believe in hell today, realized that eternal hell is not true, because it's not in the Bible. It's not. There is a long punishment for people that do not come to Christ, indicated at various moments in the New Testament, but there is not an eternal punishment in the way we have it today. So that's my basic introduction to universalism. And I make a lot of arguments in terms of biblical scripture to say, like, there's scripture which indicates universalist messaging. There's scripture which indicates various points where Christ says things like, all will be brought to me at the end of days. Paul, St. Paul of Damascus, who wrote, Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, those books, he was very universalist. He believed very, very strongly, it seems, that people will not there will not be an eternal separation from God, that some people will get to heaven first because they believed in God, but eventually all will be brought to heaven. And I think that's the most Christian message you can think. So yeah.
Okay, there's a lot for me to think about there. I think firstly,
Yeah.
I read your paper.
Yeah.
Because, okay, because you see, I still consider myself a Christian in some way, but not any way of, I view myself more as like let's call it a Judean Christian, because I see God as divided and whatnot. But anyway, we're going to get into that later. But I certainly am not dismissing any kind of I don't know, spiritual revelation or any of that. I never really had that. I'm not a spiritual person, but I hate it when people kind of sardonically just sneer at spiritual experiences, because that for me it's a real, almost objective phenomena, as in it's something that happens in
this
reality.
was something that Lacan believed too. Lacan, in his later seminar, he did a seminar on Saint John of Cross. He was a saint born in the 1500s, 1520s, something like that. And basically, John wrote all of his mystical experiences down. And what Lacan says is that he truly experienced this. This is we cannot just throw this to the side like Freud would do. Freud would say that he's a neurotic and he can't deal with the separation from the mother, or the separation from mythical unity. So Freud would say that. Lacan says no, what St. John experienced, he actually experienced. We don't know what he experienced, but he experienced something. He didn't just experience an illusion, he experienced something. And Lacan calls this other jouissance, other with a capital O, other jouissance, which big other jouissance would be the full way, which means that it's a form of jouissance which is so different from what we're used to in our lives. Lacan feels the need to have to give this the new term. So that's something I admire about Lacan, is that he certainly was not as closed off to spirituality as Freud. So
For sure.
Yeah.
Despite him being an atheist, right? At least he proclaimed to be one.
Well, that's another. I agree with his brother that Lacan was faithful privately. I can send you the link to this.
Please do.
Yeah, so Lacan's brother has done one interview ever with a journalist. It was in 1996. This guy named Paul Rosen. He was just some random journalist, but he contacted Marc-Louis Lacan, and he decided to do it. And he sat down with him. He went to his monastery because he's a monk. And Lacan's brother. So he sat down with him, and he was like, tell me about Jacques' relationship with spirituality. And the brother said, I wholeheartedly believe that Lacan was a Catholic till the day he died. Lacan created this facade that he wasn't Catholic in order to appease French academia and in order to gain status, because he knew he would be left out. But Lacan studied with me. Lacan read all these Catholic books. Lacan went to Mass. Lacan baptized a second child. Lacan almost had his funeral, almost put in his will for the funeral to be in a, I think he did have his funeral in a church. He had his funeral in a church. He baptized a second child. His first marriage was in a church. So a lot of these events seem to indicate Lacan had some sort of private dealings with Christ, but only God knows. I don't want to speculate. So that's it.
Gosh, oh yeah. Also, for me, in many ways, I'm a Kierkegaardian, and I kind of always resonate with that kind of deep personal struggle with, subjective struggle with God, because in many ways that's how I read Kierkegaard, and there's something, perhaps I get a sense of jouissance from that itself, just which is why I don't even know if I believe in God, but if people do ask from me, especially if it's someone who's, let's say, secular, I would say I'm still a Christian, because I never stop thinking about it. It is something that I'm working through. But on the note, let me ask you this, Hunter. So theoretically, I understand that you had a kind of a subjective spiritual experience too, but theoretically, how has Lacan and Hegel helped you with your faith and with Christianity?
One of the main things is, again, talking about like repression and Lacan, and understanding, I guess, the function of what Lacan calls, I guess jouissance maybe would be it. I'm trying to avoid adding a lot of Lacan terms, but we'll say jouissance.
Well, in this case, probably should say jouissance, because you can't say pleasure, because pleasure is it's got a very jouissance is probably a good term.
So I think these terms really help when it comes to Hegel. In all honesty, I'm finding Kant to be a lot more helpful recently. In my recent paper, the paper I'm working on like right now, I have an entire section on Kant subjectivity in relation to subjectivity of another thing that it's another point I want to go to, but I'm finding Kant much more helpful right now. because Kant allows for that limit. And I think Hegel's big misstep was not allowing for that limit. And I think this is the logical end of Lutheranism. Hegel was an avowed Lutheran, and Hegel's whole point was Luther showed us, like Socrates, he said Luther was the new Socrates, and it was a play on words of Jesus calling himself the new Adam. So Hegel said that, well, no, Luther is the new Socrates. He's like the reimbursed version of philosophy. He's given us so much, like Socrates has. That he would say that Luther has showed us how much religion is subjective and how much it relies on reason, and how we can never move beyond believing in this reasonable creation, that the transcendent is only transcendent until we realize that when we think it's transcendent, it automatically is brought down to us. Therefore, the transcendent is always immanent. And this, I would say, is the logical end of Lutheranism. If you don't have a very rich spiritual life like that offered by the early church fathers, then you're left with this completely immanentized God. You're left with this immanentized absolute. And I think Hegel was left with this in many senses. Now, I don't think Hegel's understanding of God is complete throughout all of his writings. I would say that his most Christian moments are in his philosophy of history, his science of logic, and his lectures on religion. But I would say that there is a continuous, no, that's fine. And I would say that there is a continuous line throughout Hegel's work, that the way that we think of God always has to be related back to us. God is always in service of us. And I think that's the issue with Hegel's work, is that he trying to equate God and man. He trying to raise man to the understanding of God, when the whole point of God in classical philosophy was that God is non-understandable. This is known as an apophatic theology.
Correct.
In comparison to a cataphatic theology. Cataphatic theology says we can understand. That's a very Hegelian theology, where in a sense there were some apophatic elements. That's also, well, that's in a different essay that I put on my academia, but that there were some cataphatic elements to Hegel's absolute. But in all, Hegel's whole point is creating a cataphatic theology. It's creating a theology where reason itself is God, right? And God is not bliss, love, beauty, these Platonic terms that I use and that a lot of early Christians use. God is reason, just reason. And it's a very impersonal understanding of God that I think takes away a lot from what Christianity offers. But on another hand, I think Hegel does offer something interesting. I think his understanding of the Trinity is very, very good. I think his understanding of the Trinity, although he did it just as an analogy to then say, well, now we're moving into logic. We're taking these Trinitarian terms and we're divesting them of their content, of their picture thinking, he says, and we're moving them into logic. We're thinking them as the movement of being itself. I think what he describes as that analogy of the Trinity is very good, and I think it's very similar to what the early church fathers described too. So I would say that when it comes to Hegel's Trinity, that's probably his best aspect in terms of religion.
Okay, understood. Okay, saying that, Hunter, then how do you read the famous moment, the crucifixion, which obviously Zizek loves to expound on, and Hegel wrote on that too. So when Christ goes on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, Father, Father, why have thou forsaken me? So just to put it very, very simply, kind of the Zizekian reading of that, Hegelian Zizekian reading of that would be, this is the God of the beyond is brought down to earth, that kind of the, as you said, the transcendent God that separates, the separation itself that we humans have is imposed onto God himself, which is what Christ experiences, like a void. So I'm assuming you don't agree with that reading. Yeah. How has their thinking on that changed?
Yeah. So one thing I would point out is that verse is only in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Luke didn't put it in there. He didn't think it was important. He didn't put it in there. And Luke is also the most detailed gospel when it comes to Christ's resurrection. So that says something, I think. It shows, this kind of Bedouin reading, perhaps, that the resurrection of Christ mattered much more in terms of the spirit of Christianity in total. This Father, Father, why have you forsaken me is merely a moment until Christ is resurrected, when his doubts about faith are forgone. Kind of like the story of Job, you can say, where Job doubts God over and over and over, but then eventually God proves himself to Job, and Job then Job is fine with God. He's happy at the end of the story. That's kind of the way that I read the Gospel of Luke. And I think it's very important that it's not in Luke. That line is not in Luke at all. Instead of that line in Luke, basically it's a discussion between Jesus and the two robbers on the cross next to him. One of them basically is like, "Ha, you're the Son of Man, but you can't get yourself down." The other robber goes, this is the Son of Man. Do not say this to him. You are blaspheming him. And Jesus then turns to the guy that says that protected him and goes, "You will be with me and my Father in heaven." So that's what's replaced. A beautiful line of hope, beautiful line of being inducted into heaven. And I think that is the importance of the Gospel of Luke. And that is why I think that the Father, Father line, why have you forsaken me, it's relevant, but it's not the main focus. And I think Luke perfectly demonstrates that, because not only is it not included, but the resurrection is given the most detailed account in any of the Gospels in Luke.
Certainly.
Yeah.
But also, maybe because the resurrection is important too, because this relates a lot to the idea of Holy Spirit, the community of believers, love.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. I haven't read a lot of Bajot. I've read a bit of Being an Event, and then of course probably his most famous book, In Praise of Love, or like for popular, his most popular.
Yeah.
What's your current understanding of the resurrection?
Yeah, so I think the resurrection happened. I 100% believe it. I've looked into a bit of the history of it. I'm still looking into that. But in terms of what it seems that a lot of, we want to get into a discussion about the scholarship of it. So it seems that the majority of scholars accept kind of a couple of points. One, Jesus was crucified on the cross. Two, Jesus was then taken off the cross that afternoon, put in a tomb. And then three, it seems that still kind of the majority, it's kind of oscillating, but the tomb was empty. That's the main stickler point, it seems, for scholars, is was the tomb empty? Because if the tomb was empty, there's a couple of options, right? Jesus rose, Christianity's true, or the disciples stole the body. This was what Matthew said in Matthew 27:28.
Bit of a
Matthew
conspiracy.
yeah. So Matthew 27:28 basically is Matthew saying, well, the story that's still circulated about the resurrection by the Jews is that we stole the body, that the disciples stole the body, but he says that's not accurate. So that story from Matthew, we hear that the story that the disciples stole the body was very popular in Jewish circles at the time, because they didn't want to, you can say if you're a Christian, you would say that because they blinded themselves to the truth of Christ. They created the story that the disciples stole the body in order to blind themselves from Christ's truth. Now, another theory is, okay, if the tomb was empty, maybe the Romans moved him. There's a lot of critical scholars who say that the Romans put him in a tomb, and then eventually they took him out, or something else happened, or maybe he never was in the tomb in the first place, and he was just thrown into a pit to die and whatever. Now, there's, of course, the other option, which would be he rose. So you kind of have those options. Or you can kind of disagree further back. You can disagree with a point that he was even taken off the cross. This is an interesting argument. The main argument for this point would be that Roman penal code at the time did not require criminals to be taken off the cross during crucifixion. Largely, they would just leave them up there for humiliation purposes, and further so that ravagers can come by and take their clothes or take whatever they want from them. So it was humiliation, so ravagers can take their clothes, and as a display of Rome's glory, to say that, ha, look at this criminal. He's an example for all of you. Do not break the law. Now, this is a pretty good argument, but a good point would be that the Rome was really, really big about not having a Jewish uprising. And so because the Jewish leaders wanted Jesus dead, they really, I would argue, they wanted to appease them. And so they said, this guy is so important to you, we will take him off the cross, because Jewish penal code, Jewish ritual was burying crucifixion victims. This is both in Leviticus. So in Leviticus, it says that if you crucify someone, bury them. And also this was practiced at the time. So Jewish code was, we bury victims. We do not humiliate them forever. Their bodies don't sit up. We bury them. We have at least a modicum of respect for them. So this would be the point that a Christian would make, is that, well, the body was taken off because the Jewish leaders pushed the Roman state, because they were the ones that, in various gospel accounts, they wanted the ones that Jesus said. Luke says that Pilate didn't even really want it. So depending on which gospel account you take, whatever, but they had a say in the Roman Empire, and they were like, no, our code says that we want him taken down, and because he rebelled against us, mainly since he was a Jew that rose up against the Jews, we should be the ones that are able to decide his fate, right? So that would kind of be the argument, that he was taken down from the cross because the Jewish leaders wanted him to. Put in the tomb, rose. But I mean, yeah, I'm still looking into the historicity of it.
I guess for me, I'm interested in more of the symbolic, because I don't even know the corporeal resurrection, how to even make sense of that.
I think that's a good point. And I would say that we should leave it as a mystery. This is the point that Orthodox makes, is that these mysteries, they're good. They should be mysteries. We should separate ourselves from God. And this would be a very anti-Hegelian point. We're creating these limits, right? That's my point, is that I think I'm finding more use in Kant recently. We're creating these limits, and we create these limits, to keep the divine notion, to not bring them down.
Yeah. In fact, you might appreciate Gabriel Marcel in that sense, the French Christian existentialist. He has a book called Mystery and Being, which he talks a lot about the importance of having mystery. It's a kind of a, almost we need it to be human subjects. All right, Hunter, a lot to get into here. I think I need to first read your papers, because I can't really have any in-depth. I would say I can't really ask any substantial questions until I read your more theological work. So 2 questions before we end the pod. Firstly, in that case, how do you read the Lacanian notion of there is no big other? Is that something? What's your reading of that statement?
I would just have to throw it out, more or less. Yeah, I'd have to throw it out. Which would be like my main sticking point with Lacan. I would be like, I accept this, reject that, which is, I don't know, maybe I'm a heretical Lacanian. I don't know. Maybe I'll be tossed out from the Church of Lacan. Yeah.
I was thinking though, like for me, I would say I wonder if you could reconcile the fact that when they say there is no big other, it's not big other in the sense that there's no God. It's more in the sense of the kind of
human authority would
kind of the big other.
If I was writing a paper and I would talk about it, I would say that it's Lacan is really saying that human authorities are always or I can go even further. I know what I say. All right, I'm just thinking about this now. I would say that human authorities are created by humans, right? But that the true authority is God. So when we say that there is no big other, there is no real human authority, because the real authority is God. That's what I would say. I would say that the big other only applies there.
Yeah, because I never really. In fact, I read one of Zizek's essays, "There Is No Big Other," and my kind of, let's say, spontaneous kind of reaction to it was, it's not, even though Zizek identifies as a Christian atheist, it's not him explicitly stating there is no God. I mean, what the hell does that even mean, right? To declare there's no God. I mean, who the hell am I, to even say that? But okay, then the last question in that case, Hunter, is what's your reading of let's say that more of the Christian mystics like Marseille Card or Simone Weil? How do you think their understanding of God is accurate? Does it align with kind of your theology? But just in general, kind of just
so Eastern Christianity has always been very big about mysticism. Mysticism is a very mean word people throw around today. It's like you're a mystic, you're like secretive, you're not
like an insult, isn't it?
Yeah. So mystic in the Eastern thought is just the point that we value subjective experiences of God. When someone says that they've had a subjective experience of God, we believe them. If you look at a lot of Western thought, especially American Christians, if you told them that you had a subjective experience of God, they would look at you like you're crazy. Eastern Christians are very big about the importance of subjective experiences and believing those people that had them. Now, of course, if someone's like, every day I wake up and I'm experiencing Jesus and he's walking across my room, you can kind of engage in some sort of, well, I don't know, I mean, maybe, I mean, depending on how great your spiritual life, maybe, but the point is that we tend to believe people more when they say they've had subjective experiences of God. Now, from this, Meister Eckhart was certainly a wonderful mystic. I have been recently rereading his work. He has this selected writings from
Yes,
human classics.
I've got that book. It's a fantastic book. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. One of the key sentences that I remember that has always stuck with me is, I think it's, all right, I'm going to try and get it right, but it's like you have to, okay, so it's, there is the one, we are in the one is in one, and then there's one other line, but it's like one, it's something like that. And the point is to say that like God is in all of us in the immanent sense that like all of us are made in the image of God, and we have the chance to become in the likeness of God following Genesis 1:6. Genesis 1:26. We have the tendency to become in the likeness of God. Further, God is one. He is self-sufficient. He is self-existent. He is fully omniscient, omnipotent, all that. And the world is God in the sense that drawing a direct line between creation and God is not very good, I'd say. And this is another mystic Eastern point, is that we don't really draw a strict line between nature and God. Of course, God is different than nature, but as Isaiah 46 says, each blade of grass has God. The totality of God is expressed in a single blade of grass, right? So it's difficult to try and draw a clear delineation between God and nature. Of course, there is a sort of delineation, but when we draw these clear delineations, like I think a lot of Western thought does, they'll go, God is up here, nature's down here. No. God is both immanent and transcendent.
Yeah.
He is, and I'll play a Lacanian term here. In my essay that you'll probably read at some point, you'll see where I apply this term, Lacan's term of, oh, wait, no, I just forgot the term. No, I didn't. Oh, no, I forgot the term. I'll use the scholastic term instead. Okay.
Sure. Go for
I use both of them in the paper. So, no, I got the term. We're good. Lacan's term of extimate. So it's a, I mentioned it somewhere in my book. It's a neologism of the French intimite and extimate. Extimate, intimate. Lacan creates extimate. Extimate is one of his many descriptions of subjectivity. The subject is both in the world and out the world at the same time, right? I would say God is both in the world and out the world at the same time. To try and say God is fully in the world, that's atheism, that's Hegelian absolutism. To say that God is out the world is some weird, like, I don't even know like what that would, just like the most like naive interpretation of God. God has to be both immanent and fully transcendent, and the only way that we can say God is fully immanent and transcendent is if we leave the mystery of how he can be to be a mystery. And that's the big thing about Eastern thought. Holy mysteries are very important. This would be a holy mystery. How is God both in everything and one in himself? How is the Trinity both one in? How is the Trinity both a distinction and a unity and distinction? Now, I have various explanations I give of the Trinity and papers, but we would just say that even if these explanations do not fully satisfy someone, we would just say that it's a mystery, and it should be a mystery. This mystery is good because it gives us wonder, and it gives us insight, and it gives us mystery into God's mystery, because God is himself a mystery.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've got a question though, Hunter. I mean, I know I said the last question was the last question, the previous question was the last question, but I really need to ask you this. Yeah, a part of me struggles with this giving the salience or accentuating, let's say, subjective experience in this sense, right? So how do you, in contrast to, let's say, the Pentecostal charismatic Christianity, which is here in Australia, it's huge. Like we've got Hillsong, Planet Shakers.
It's unfortunate, yeah.
It's what would it call it? Capitalist Christianity.
Yes, I would call it that.
And how would you, things like speaking in tongues and going to church, like the Pentecostal Christianity, how do you juxtapose that, or in contrast to when you say in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, where we hold subjective experiences like the mystics, for instance, in high regard. What's the difference between those two? Because even one could argue even the charismatic Christians and Pentecostal Christians do hold subjective experience in high regard.
Yeah, so this is the clear difference. It's a term called theosis, a Greek term, and it's better translated to divinization or deification. So Eastern Orthodox is the one church that holds theosis as true. In simple, theosis is the doctrine that through spiritual life, Christians are becoming ontologically more like God. I know it's a little out there, but it's a very ancient idea.
That's a very nice statement you just said.
Yes, yeah, ontologically more. So in most all Western forms of Christianity, you can only become like God in terms of morality, right? You know, you do good actions. People say you read your Bible and then, you know, you pray, and then your community with God is a moral closeness. You are morally becoming more like him. We say you are ontologically and morally becoming closer to him. Now, this ontological closeness is very important because we don't say that you can become God himself. This would be heresy. This is some like pantheistic garbage. We would say that you can become like God with a lower G God. You become like God, you become like an angel. We have various stories from church fathers who were so far in their path of theosis that when they would wake up in the morning, they could look around the room and they could see the purpose, God's purpose of things in the things. What's called the logi of things. Logoi is another Greek word. The logi of things, God's purpose in the things themselves. They could see it because they have become so ontologically like God. This, in the Eastern thought, is the goal of Christianity. It is the goal of being alive. The goal of existing is to become like God, to undergo this process of divinization through a spiritual life and become like God. Now, the common response people will give is, well, isn't this exactly what Adam tried to do in the Garden of Eden? And wasn't this why God, struck him down? Well, no, it's the exact opposite. Adam tried to self-deify himself. He did not engage in humility and ascetic practices in order to become like God. He just tried to become like God immediately out of his own selfishness. That is against theosis. Theosis is only becoming like God through giving yourself to God. It is a giving action, an ontological action.
I see what you mean.
That's how fundamental this point is. It is an ontological giving and receiving of godliness. It's something that is no other form of Christianity has. The Catholics stopped doing it under Aquinas. They used to hold it. Aquinas said it was pantheistic and Gnostic and pagan. They threw it away after Aquinas. And of course, the Vatican II doesn't even talk about it now. Protestantism, you won't find it, of course. I mean, it's such a fundamental point that I think that a spiritual life has to recognize to just be so rich. And I think that recognizing this point has been so fundamental for me. And I think it's fundamental for so many other people that have found themselves in this Eastern tradition. So.
Yeah, because Hunter, until you just said that last bit, I think you hit the nail on the head, because a lot of this theosis, and I like that ontological closeness. In fact, I think Simone Weil, in her book, Waiting for God, kind of touches on this, one of my favorite mystics. Because for me, I was thinking, oh, that sounds very narcissistic. I mean, who the hell am I to think that I can be like God? And in fact, I would say a lot of kind of this new age Christianity has that element that I am God. I am
exactly.
And so I was, until you made that clear delineation
with the Adam. Yeah. It's really helps, because a lot of people immediately think, well, this is just like narcissism. Well, no, the whole point is that God gives us this ability to become like him in some ways because he loves us, because his grace is inextinguishing, it's everlasting. He gives us this ability. He didn't have to. He gives us this because he loves us. By nature of who God is, he gives us this ability to become like him. If only we will accept him and begin this process of divinization.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end it, Hunter. I almost called you Adam. Hey man, what can I say? It's a good place to end it, man. That was beautiful. A
Mm.
lot to think about now. Look, now I may reach out to you in a month or two again to discuss purely just Christianity. You put a lot of, as you can clearly see, I'm struggling with this too. But you put a lot of thoughts in my head that I need to kind of think about and expound. And
I will personally recommend, I would just try praying. I
yes,
would just
it's
try
something I
praying.
struggle with quite a lot. It's probably
Yeah.
because I'm a narcissist too. Because when I'm praying, I'm like, what the hell am I doing? I'm like, what's this nonsense? But then
Yeah.
there's
I
something
will
in the
so
acts, in the rituals themselves, isn't it?
yeah, yeah. Um, what I would say is a prayer schedule is good. Praying every morning helps when you first wake up, first thing on your mind. Um, if you want a classic Orthodox prayer that we say, it's called the Jesus prayer. I can write it
Oh
down
yes,
in
I do know
the
the Jesus
chat.
one. Yeah, I do know that. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's so this is a very, very holy prayer in Orthodoxy. It's perhaps the most holy prayer. And it's Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And you repeat that over and over and over and over and over. And wonderful things happen. It is just this, I can't explain the experience, but everyone I've talked to that engages with this prayer, it brings them so much change, so much closeness, so much stillness. That's another thing I can say real quick is that Eastern Orthodoxy cares a lot about aesthetic practices, kind of like Asian thought. We believe that it's okay to do like tantric exercises where you're heavy breathing and stuff like that. But the stipulation would be that when you're engaging in these exercises like meditation, you should always keep repeating Jesus's name or another like divine name, in order to not give your mind over to the world. Engaging in fully like aesthetic practices is kind of against the faith. We would say that it's good to just keep repeating Jesus's name, but you can do heavy breathing, you can hold yourself in a yoga position, whatever. But yeah, I would just say that repeating that prayer helps a lot. Whenever you're feeling stressed, whenever you're, just need a time to for yourself, just try praying it. That's what I'll end with.
Yeah. Would you say you're part of any Orthodox Christian community, like a church?
Yeah, I'm not a member yet, but I've been going to liturgy every Sunday for about 3 Sundays now.
Yeah, they're beautiful church.
Within the next 6 months, yeah, they're wonderful, and you just feel the presence of the Holy Spirit just all around you when you're there. I mean, you have the icons, and they're just beautiful, and they're radiating the Holy Spirit, and you have the people around you, and I mean, people are actually getting on their knees and praying in church, and it's just such a wonderful experience. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Sublime indeed. Yeah, thanks,
it's
Michael.
sublime. I mean, yeah, yeah,
That's a good place to end it. Thank you so much.
yeah.
Appreciate the chat on the book, and of course, I think we ended it on the best possible note
We did.
one could end a conversation on.